So it's recording. Yep. Woo, we're recording. No pressure. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, including me. So we'll just wait, if that's okay, just a couple of more minutes and we can get started. Everyone doing all right? I wish I could see everyone. So basically, if someone is phoning in, they'll be seen here. That tells you how many people are in. Is Bill coming in now? I feel like I'm doing those Facebook live videos. Like, oh, there's more people. Oh, there's more people. Oh.
Hey, Kiran.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing good. Good morning.
Good morning. We're just going to wait a minute or so and then get started. Does that sound good?
Sounds good. I'll just mute my microphone in the meantime.
Okay. Okay. Bill, do you want to say, before we get started, do you want to say a little bit about the webinar thing you're doing on Wednesday?
Sure. It's actually tomorrow, so Tuesday.
Okay.
So it'll be, U.S. time, tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Central Time. It's about Rotary Global Grants and tailored to Rotary Peace Fellows. So I know that a lot of Rotary Peace Fellows would like to participate in Rotary grant projects, partner with Rotary more closely, and that's something that Rotary wants as well. And a big part of that is learning more about what grant projects are, how they get started, how they're funded. And so the webinar will explore that and give Peace Fellows the chance to ask some questions about that and to really tailor that information to you. So lots of information coming out.
Oh, great. And the time for that is?
So that'll be 8 a.m. Central Time, United States time. So it'll be the same time tomorrow, but an hour earlier. So in 23 hours, if that makes sense.
You say 8 a.m. Central Time?
That's right. So for your time, Kiran, it'll be 9 a.m.
9 a.m. Eastern Time. Very good. Okay, maybe we will just get started and take it from there, if that's okay. So, sounds good. So just to let you know, I've got my colleague here, Linnea, and she works with me, and she's kind of, we're doing this webinar as a first time thing for us. I've never done one before, so we're really using this as a kind of a pilot, and we're both learning in the process. But Linnea is going to help me a little bit with some of the technical side of things, and also maybe to solicit some of the questions as well. If we open it up for a bit more questions towards, I want to leave at least a minimum 20 minutes for a chance to kind of ask, do Q&A, and maybe have an interactive discussion, and maybe look at some of the ideas and how we can apply it to our work. Now, I've called this Stories as a Force for Social Change, but it's really geared towards Rotary Peace Fellows, and really came out, for those of you that may not have attended, I'm not 100% sure, but it came out of the recent Rotary Peace Fellow Unconference in Hamburg, in a session that we facilitated called Story the Future. And there seemed to be a lot of interest in how we use and think about storytelling as a tool in our work. And we all work in many, many different ways, but how we can adapt it, how we can use it as a force, or even an activity, or even tell our own story. So I'm going to try and cover that. And I think the best way for me to do that is to talk more about how we here at the International Storytelling Center really shape or think about storytelling in our work. And I want to kind of go over that, tell you a little bit more about myself, so you get a bit more of the background story of who I am, and give some examples of some of the work that we are doing. So it is definitely more centric to our institution and a US context, because that's the kind of country we're in and where we're doing a lot of work. I think the examples can speak to that. And then I want to open it up with some examples of tips and ideas, and then bring it over to you and how we can think about applying some of that work or thinking about the work that you're doing, and really to open that up for Q&A. So that's the kind of basic format. So I'd ask you to keep your microphones on mute for a period of time. But if you do have questions, feel free to use the chat box. You can go straight to me or to Linnea or to all. Use your questions now. You can do that at any time, any thoughts or ideas. And we'll try to bring those questions toward that last 20 minutes. And then, yes, Linnea will give me a hand on that. So to begin, who am I? And I've got this fancy background. I think it's quite funky. It's actually from our National Storytelling Festival last year, one of the pictures. Okay, 1 second. First slide. So my name, Kiran Singh Sirah, President of International Storytelling Center, Rotary Peace Fellow from Duke UNC, 2011 to 2013. So, to begin with, what is story? Is it a thing? Is it an idea? Is it something that we only have for children? Is it something that we outgrow? Is it a verb? Is it a noun? Where did it come from? Often, people, when we think about storytelling, particularly in our tradition, in our space, we think about storytelling often as the thing that happens around the campfire. Whether that happens now or in our past, something that we remember, but also from our human history, maybe our ancestors. It's the image that comes to mind. It's often used, sharing the fire, it's kind of used as a kind of as a metaphor to some extent in the work that we do in our community, in the storytelling community. But I believe it started before that. It started when we as humans were able to look up into the sky. We saw the stars and we began to use our imagination. Storytelling really begins in the mind. It begins in imagination. And when our ancestors began to wonder and they began to dream, they started to think about what was out there. They began to search for explanations. And ever since then, people have been using stories. In fact, there's an idea that the most powerful force in the universe is the power of thought. When we think about that. But one of the most powerful means to communicate that thought is through story. And actually, story is a force in itself. It's one of the most effective means to communicate thought or ideas. And therefore, it's a social force for social change. And another way to just to think about that from living on planet Earth. We live in this planet. We have land and sea and these elements. But what is the thing that really binds us? Because really, it's just, we stand on a piece of land, but it's the story that binds us into a nation. It's story that binds us into groups, into religions, into beliefs, into traditions, into ideas as such. And they're also things that we're willing to defend or fight for or to create. We as Peace Fellows are working on the story that we are trying to create for a more peaceful world. And that's one of our binding forces, part of our story. But it's also when you think about how dangerous it can be too, when we go, are we more willing to defend that idea than create potentially the idea of allowing that story to be flexible into a global society as opposed to probably just a nationalist kind of idea. So how powerful stories, if you think about it in that context, when we really break things down, it's our identity, and identity is really important. You could argue, or I might just argue, that to some extent, our world is in a bit of an identity crisis. When you think about what's happening in Europe with Brexit, what's happening in this country with its politics and the current legislation, in Brazil, in India, in other parts of the world, with the rise of the far right, extremist ideology. So to some extent, we can think a little bit that maybe we're in a little bit of an identity crisis, but we're all trying to tell our story to be listened and maybe have our story heard. But are we willing to listen to other people's stories? And that may be the place where we should be exploring the power of how stories can be used. Let me tell you a little bit about the organization that I run. This is our center. It's the International Storytelling Center. This building is only about 19 years old. It was funded by one of our philanthropists who was CEO of Krispy Kreme, gave us $1 million, and we set up this building. But the building itself is about 14,000 square foot. Included in this building is a state-of-the-art theater where we have live performances 26 weeks of the year, but pretty much throughout the whole year, different types of events, but conference facilities, seminars. We also have a storytelling park. But this is the headquarters for our National Storytelling Festival, which is the largest event that we do in October. The facility itself, we host around 70 professional storytellers a year. And these primarily are professional storytellers, but we also bring a lot of, we class as traditional storytellers, tradition bearers, those that are maybe carrying on the tradition of their community. For example, the storytellers from the Gullah tradition, or the African American traditions, or the Native American traditions, or storytellers from different parts of the world that might be seen as the person that are the keepers of those stories. Okay, so I want to break things down a little bit into 3 components of our work. And this is performance, preservation, and practice. Now, this is not the only way to think about storytelling, but it's one of the ways I want to focus for today because it's the way that we break down our work. Now, performance. Let me just talk a little bit more about performance and we'll go through the 3. Performance. Performance is like performance-based storytelling. It's what we are known for, showcasing stories from the stage. Now, this can include traditional stories, spoken word poetry. It can include art forms such as poetry slams or story slams, as well as dance and performing arts. Our events here include, I said, the National Storytelling Festival. That's not, is an event now that attracts around 10,000 people. But throughout the year, there are about 26,000 people that come here to listen and to hear live performance storytelling from master storytellers that come from different parts of the world, different traditions. Here we have 2 particular storytellers, one from Colombia, one from New Orleans, that both tell stories from their traditions, from their folk cultures, as well as personal narrative. There's about 45,000 digital users that tune in to our work, both using our resources online, but also around the world. And as part of the National Storytelling Festival, which we live stream now, one day of the festival to about 33 countries simultaneously. So it's about 1.6 million hits to our website as a kind of a resource for storytelling. And I'll go into more detail on that too and how you can use that for your own work. Just to give you a kind of an idea of live performance storytelling, why it's so a magical space. Well, we consider storytelling as the world's oldest art form, the world's oldest form of communication, most effective form of communication. And we're keeping that tradition alive. So when you come to an event, you might hear a story that's been passed down through generations from a 40,000-year-old civilization. But you might also hear a story from a 9/11 experience, or an LGBTQ story, or a story about survival, resilience, or resistance. And these are very important because they're all storytelling. And under that kind of the banner, it shows a spectrum of the type of stories that can be told, can be shared, can be explored. Last year, a couple of years ago, we had, to give you an example, we had someone, Piper Kerman, who is the author of Orange is the New Black, and she came to the festival and talked about stories from incarceration and really was exploring the work that she's doing and using storytelling to advocate for and promote awareness around issues around incarceration in the US prison system. So Mr. Donald Davis from the stage. Here are some more images. As you can tell, we have these big marquee tents that fit around 1,700 people per tent, but we also have very small, intimate spaces where you can have 3 or 4 people or 90 people. It's a much more intimate space in which can take the issues, allow for the sessions to be much more interactive, unpack, and some can just be funny and humorous, and that's good too. So I want to move now into preservation, and this is our kind of other area of work. Preservation is an effort really to collect and celebrate, protect the oral traditions from around the world. We don't just do it ourselves, we do that in partnership with the Smithsonian Institution for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, as well as many other folklore-based institutions, not just here, but different parts of the world, because we believe that oral traditions are something to be protected and preserved for future generations, just like the indigenous peoples have done that up until present time. These traditions can be part of our shared cultural heritage. We have a collection of we do that also by collecting videos from our National Storytelling Festival, and these stories make up the largest single collection that can tell the story of the movement. And we keep all those stories in our archive and in our nation's capital at the Library of Congress, the American Folk Life Center. This collection includes about 4,000 hours of moving image, about 200,000 items. The stories from Jack McConnell, Jackie Torrance, Alex Haley, Pete Seeger, many other types of storytellers going right back to 1973. Preservation is about preserving our traditions. It's about preserving our culture and our rituals and our helping to open up a doorway to a way that we once were or a way that we are. And it's a very important part. Imagine if that was taken away from you and you were born and didn't understand the places where you came from, the traditions to which form part of your identity or shaped you into a person. That's why it's very important that we try to collect that for humanity itself, the stories that make up our story as one human society. Now I want to go into practice, and I should probably say a little bit about that preservation part. One of the programs that we're trying to do is to digitize the entire collection in a way that communities can use these stories in an accessible way for promoting social causes. And that's one of the programs that we're working on. But I want to talk about practice. Now practice is also called applied storytelling. And it's something that I think is most relevant for today's discussion, and probably you're thinking about in your own work, and maybe why you joined this webinar, is because this practice is really about taking storytelling and applying it in a way to support the work you might be doing. Now we can do that. We do it here with organizations and businesses, as well as we do it in classrooms, as part of the peace building community, the health sector, wellness. We also work with organizations to advance scientific causes and much more, but the practice is really about the application of that and how that can be used. A lot of this has been informed by a 2009 piece of research that we did here with Harvard Graduate School of Education on a project called Project Zero, which produced a whole bunch of comprehensive reports on the use of storytelling in business, education and literacy, peace and conflict resolution. And these reports have informed our education and outreach program and the application of our partnerships in that arena. Now, how can you access that? So here, again, are some tips, some ideas. And this is a section on our website that we call the Learning Library. It's still a section that we are developing and we're enhancing, we're adding to all the time. But I think it's a good starting point if you want to look at resources that you can be using if you're working in a specific community, or you're working on a particular issue or cause, or you're looking for resources that could perhaps align with some of the missions and goals of your work. In this we have, for the classroom, if you're a teacher or an educator, examples of how you can apply lesson plans to storytelling events, tie that with maybe a US-based curriculum. Exploring Race Bridges is a collection of stories which can be used to explore issues around race and identity, particularly to facilitate conversations with young people. And then down below, we have this Telling Stories That Matter toolkit. This is a free toolkit. Now, I'll give you a little bit of context of this. I began writing this when I was a Rotary Peace Fellow and I did my AFE, my applied field experience, actually in Washington, D.C., with a bunch of peace building institutions that Partners for Democratic Change, and also with the wider community. I'm also a slam poet, so I connected a lot with the arts community and the Smithsonian community. This toolkit came out as a result, and it's really a toolkit that's aimed with field practitioners that maybe English is a second language, and it gives you examples of how you can use storytelling in documentation, or you might use storytelling to collaborate, to collect stories. It also talks a little bit about ethics as well, and remembering that story that you might collect doesn't actually belong to you. It belongs to the storyteller, and being very sort of respectful of that. But how that you can use that to build rapport. Thinking about storytelling at the forefront of our work as opposed to afterwards. How can it support conflict prevention? How can it help us build rapport and build relationships? Now, I would advise that if you use this toolkit, use it as a guide, not as a step-by-step process, because that's really how it's been designed. It's really for you to kind of look at how can you take that, like a recipe book, take the recipe, adapt it to your context, to the projects that you're doing, and think of it more as a sort of like a guide, as a resource. And this is something that we could really sort of work on if you have questions about, because I wrote the toolkit, I understand it, so you can always use that as if you want to apply this toolkit into your work. And I will say that one of the programs that we're going to be going forward on with Jessica Trisberg in Australia, the city of Melton, and some of our partners here as part of our new games project, is we're going to be converting some of this into a digital platform to make it much more accessible for young people and communities to use in their own way to collect their stories. So just to give you a heads up on that, and that's to come. All right, where are we? We're in 10:20. So now I want to talk a little bit about some examples of some work. Now here's one program we do, Young Appalachian Story Summit, aimed at 16 to 30-year-olds. And this is really designed for young people that are maybe social entrepreneurs, farmers, people that care about a region and want the tools to look at how to use story to advance their causes, their ideas, and be the story for change. And this is really just an event, and so it's worth thinking about in the context of we're working, just bringing people together, because whenever we bring people together, you're creating a storytelling event. Because that's naturally what we do when we come together. We don't talk in facts, we talk in stories. But this particular event is one of the programs that we do, and it happens just once a year. So, and then there may be more open places if you have young people that would like to attend. Another one is particularly for younger people, called Stories for Change. And Stories for Change is aimed at young people at risk between the ages of 13 and 16. I mean, you can vary this, but this particular program is for younger teens, and particularly young people that feel excluded from society. And now we know that when young people feel excluded from society, they don't feel they've been listened to, then they're more vulnerable, and they're more vulnerable to join dangerous groups, whether that is the KKK or ISIS or other types of groups, dangerous ideologies. And so this is really a chance to really sort of think about how story can be applied in a way that recognizing that every story counts. If you have a story of struggle, resilience, or a story from your life about your home, your community, this story matters, and it can be harnessed, and you can use that to be your vehicle. So really giving young people, empowering young people to learn how to become public speakers and to share their story in a way that can give them a chance to navigate through their society in a way that's meaningful for them. Now, this is a program that we're now particularly doing for young girls in our community, because young girls have a particular dip in confidence in their early teens. And as a result of the Me Too movement, we decided that we wanted to focus on young girls' empowerment. So it's led by all women as leaders and teachers and teaching artists, and that's called the Sheroes Journey. Okay, and here are just some examples of types of workshops that professional storytellers that come here, type of things that they might be doing. And this might relate to some of the work that you do, stories to build positive change inside and outside of your institution. stories to encourage empathy and tolerance, storytelling in grief and bereavement. This is all part of the work that we do. Maybe not directly connected to your work particularly, but I think it's part of the work that we do collectively. Here are some partnerships that we work with. We also work with Her Majesty the Queen, Dolly Parton, who I consider the Queen anyway, and as a Tennessean. Why is she important? Because we think that she is a perfect example of the hero's journey. We like to call the shero's journey. She came from poverty. She didn't accept the narrative of coming from poverty and her place in Appalachia. And she overcame the obstacles and followed her dream and went on her life journey. And she shared her story with others. She harnessed her ability to tell her story in her own way. And then she came back home. And then she shared her gifts, not just with her physical home community, but with the world. And it's one of the reasons why she's loved so much, not just here, but across the world, but particularly in Tennessee. And so we not just work with her because we think she's wonderful, but because she's an example of the shero's journey itself. Someone that has been the story for change for herself, but inspired others. So I call her a peace builder, and I think her work is very important. We also work with the Google Cultural Institute to present some of our online programs to a partnership with the Google Cultural Institute, Arts and Culture, to make some of the exhibits and resources accessible to about 14 million people through their networks. We do ad hoc collaborations, and we did one in 2014 for International Day of Peace, which was hosted by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Dr. Jane Goodall and Yo-Yo Ma, and a young storyteller called Velma Makuro, who came from Kenya, was trained to tell her story publicly, and she told her story live at the United Nations on the September 23rd. And that was a partnership with Masterpiece as an organization. The Alliance for Peace Building, leading roundtable sessions, thinking about how we bring groups of people together for roundtables on particular issues around topics. And one of those was actually looking at policy change and how to affect and reframe a policy that could work within this current legislation we have in this country. The Desmond Tutu Peace Foundation and Ubuntu Initiative, the Smithsonian Institution, United Way, and NASA are one of our closest science partners. And that particularly is interesting because that started around 2004 with the Mars rover landing mission, and we trained their scientists and NASA JPL to tell the story of that mission. But that has really evolved into NASA scientists attending our big flagship events every year at the festival and learning how to take storytelling and applying it to scientists and telling the story of those missions in an accessible way. Because sometimes scientists don't do that particularly well. So it's taking that ideas that are really important ideas about curiosity, imagination, these complex ideas, and embedding it in a story that makes sense to a 5-year-old, to an 8-year-old. Okay, we're serious about storytelling, and we believe in story as a powerful force for social change. So why do I tell you all this? Okay. So why do I tell you all this? Well, it's important as an institution for our work, but I also want to put it this way. I want to ask you just to close your eyes just for a moment. I want you to imagine that you're checking your phone right now and you're finding out that your leader of your country has decreed that you have 3 months to leave. And if you don't, you will be killed. He doesn't care where you go, just not here. And the place that you end up, it will be a different season. You will probably look very different from the people currently living there. And you most likely won't be welcome. So what do you take and where do you start? You could be weighing in various possessions right now. You're probably thinking your photo album, your mother's ring, of course, your coffee cup or your laptop. Perhaps you're thinking about the things that you love, the places that you would have to say goodbye to, because you can't load them onto your arms, onto your back. Okay, so that you can open your eyes. Now, this was the dilemma that my parents faced in the summer of 1972 when they were living in Uganda in East Africa, their home at the time. And when they, on the summer of 1972, on public radio, the then dictator Idi Amin declared that all Ugandan Asians would be forced out or executed. They had 3 months to leave. That literally meant 50,000 people. Some fled to Kenya, others to Canada, some to India. But my parents, Sikhs of Indian heritage, went to the United Kingdom. Now, what little they could take was actually stolen by robbers en route to the airport. And when they arrived in a small English town called Eastbourne, in the middle of a British winter, they didn't have any of the right clothes. And it was in the midst of a terrible anti-immigrant wave in England. A lot of people hated them on sight. You can open your eyes. That's a memory that stays with me, and it's a powerful one because it was passed on to me. I grew up in South England, but it was a story that was very much not just that one, but that stayed with me and helped me to navigate and make me understand where I came from. As someone that was born in the United Kingdom, as the first person of color in my hometown, in the midst of this anti-immigrant wave, when I was called names or made fun of, I was bullied in the classroom, I could reveal the stories of where I came from, that my people were actually once were warriors. They were fighting people. There were people that were stood up to an unjust regime. There's people that fought and navigated through resilience, and they passed those stories on to me, and they helped to form a really strong part of my identity. And when I look back, I think about my story, that's a very important time in my life, and probably one of the reasons why it shaped that amongst many others, shaped me into the person that I am today, and why I believe peace matters. Now, I want you to consider for a moment how much you carry in your head, because the human brain consists of about 100 billion neurons. Each neuron forms about 1,000 connections to other neurons, and they keep combining so that each neuron helps with multiple memories at a time, which increases the brain's memory storage capacity to something like 1 million gigabytes. Now, if your brain was like a DVR, that would be enough bandwidth to hold about 3 million hours worth of TV. So if you try and imagine watching that on Netflix over 300 years, that's how much your brain can hold, and the memories. But these memories are incredibly important because in those memories are your stories. That sort of capacity is not to be taken lightly, because there's more to life than storage, which also means over a lifetime's worth of story, you think about, you don't just carry your own stories, you carry your grandparents' stories, your parents' stories, and your grandparents. You carry your friends' stories and your country stories, your culture stories, and all the stories that you come into contact with daily. Likewise, your story is not just your story alone. Your story is part of your parents' story and your grandparents' story and your friend's story and your country story and your culture story. All stories are interconnected and woven together, just like the neurons in our brain that create an endless and endlessly powerful collection of stories. It's more than your family tree. It's more of a global personal web. I mean, if you look at us all right now on this webinar, or the people around us, or people in our lives, the people we've witnessed today, we all have stories. Everyone around you has stories, memories, and millions of moments from their lives that make up who they are and what they believe, where they've been, and where they want to go. And just like the antidotes, oh yeah, one time when I was 11, or the funniest thing happened, it's actually the law that gets passed down from us, like I explained, from our parents or our grandparents, the idiosyncrasies and the history and the recipes, the music. In fact, it is your DNA. So think about it along those lines. It's not just people that make up the millions of moments, but it's also about movements too. And I want to take, for example, one particular movement, and it's the American Civil Rights Movement. It's remembered as one movement, a singular entity, a lone moment in time which altered the course of American history. But it's so much more than that. It's Rosa Parks and her decision that she rightfully deserved her seat on the bus when she was tired after a long day of work. It's Ruby Bridges and her story of her parents' willingness to desegregate the William Franks Elementary School in Louisiana. It's the Little Rock Nine who were the first black students to attend Little Rock High School in Arkansas once segregation was outlawed. And it's this person here that I'm sure you'd recognize. It's Reverend Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, and his soul-shaking speeches. It's the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama. But it also continues with moments like the 2008 election of President Barack Obama, America's first black president. And there are thousands of other moments that have made up and continue to make up the movement to this day. The promise of this one movement is still being fulfilled and the stories are still being told. These moments, these stories are part of the collective history, our shared narrative. And these stories come together to form a seminal moment in our time. But they also serve as seminal moments in individual lives too. These stories are the gifts that we pass on to the present. Your stories are gifts that you pass on to those that come after you. It's what binds you to your past. A story has the potential to hold time and to stop it too. If you think about that, that's not just in story, but that is the power of the arts as a whole. And if we're willing to listen, it's actually what binds us to each other. Here are two inspirational heroes of mine. Bryan Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, who built the memorial to lynching, which opened last year in Montgomery, Alabama, in the Deep South, also known as the cradle of the Confederacy. And he's igniting a national conversation for us to think about an important part of this particular nation and its story that we still haven't really explored, unpacked, or untold. And he says something that's really important, where he believes that the opposite of poverty is actually justice. Alex Haley. Alex Haley is the founder of Roots. If you are a young child that grew up with that TV show, I remember it very much so. It's very much emphasized a story about the passing on traditions and culture and rituals from one culture to the next, and about resilience. He is an East Tennessean and has also performed here at the National Storytelling Festival. And when he did, he said, without storytelling, we'd have no roots. Mr. Alex Haley. That's me a few years ago when I had a little bit less weight, not as tubby as I am now. I told you part of my story, why that's important. And I explained that's really much important for me because when people ask me when storytelling began for me, it began as part of my parents passing on their traditions and their stories to me. And that's helped to form who I am. Somebody once said to me, actually, my boss at one point said, you need to stop being so political. I said, how can I when I was born brown in an all-white society? It's why I'm a storyteller. Storytelling is intrinsically linked to the identity and my purpose and my cause. I believe storytelling is the force that can help us shift the world and change the narrative. We have to remember too that story belongs to all of us. It's part of the collective being and the tapestry of humanity. Story is the future, and we shape the future with story. Everyone on this call, we're all in the process of creating our own narratives, which in turn directs our future. Our stories are not static. What have you learned from your family stories? Think about that. What have you learned from your friends' stories? What are you learning from the stories we hear in the news today? And how can we unpack and see the story behind the story? How are they changing you? How are they influencing you? And how are your stories affecting those that come after you? Because in shaping our future, we shape someone else's past. We won't do that right now because of time, but I want to sort of close on the formal part of this and think about, if you get a chance today, and I'd love it to be today, just get a piece of paper or sit alone for 1 minute. I'd like you to close your eyes and think into the future. use your imagination. And I want you to think about the future of a world that is peaceful, utopia. What does that look like to you? Imagine that place, and in that place is a library. In that library is an exhibit. In that exhibit or book is a photograph. When you open that, you see that photograph. That photograph has you in it. And this could be 100 years from now, it could be 2000, it could be 50 years from now. But in that is a photograph, not of a portrait of you standing and knowing the camera's there. It's a photograph of you in action, of your proudest moment, of how you helped to contribute, the single moment, how you contribute to making this world a better place. Is it something that's happened? Are they parts of your life that happened from your childhood that shaped you, or is it yet to happen? What is the story of that moment? Because that is the story of how we help to story the future. And think about that in the context of our work. Remember, our past are moments. The moments that shaped us today. What are the moments we're creating now? And what is the story of the future? You can think about that in a public speech, as your call for action, or in the work that you are doing to shape the work. Why is your non-profit important? What story is it creating? Why is the work that you're doing to train young people important? Etc. You can adapt that in a way that suits you. But from the time that people looked up into the sky and began to wonder and dream, began to imagine, story has been part of us, and it will continue to be part of us for a very long time, as we continue to wonder, to dream, and to imagine. That's where storytelling begins. And through that, we can help to build a better world. So that's the end of my formal part. We've got about 20 minutes left, so I'm using my technology here and getting a little bit of help from my colleague here, but if there's particular questions, we've got 20 minutes left for conversations, Q&A, any particular questions you'd like to pose to me or to each other. I think we'll either take them through the chat box or we can unmute, because there's not as many of us. So would anybody like to unmute and ask anything?
Hi, Kiran. This is Bill.
Oh, hey, you disappeared from the screen. Oh, no, you're not. You're down there.
I disappeared for...
Sorry. I'm like, can you...
I thought it was... just to make a comment, and maybe you can talk about this a little bit. You talked about digitizing one of your storytelling collections. I found that kind of interesting. Can you talk a little bit about different mediums for storytelling? You obviously have the event where people tell their stories on stage, but there's also storytelling through writing. Now there's storytelling through social media and other forms. Can you talk a little bit just about the different methods of storytelling and how that relates to your work, and how that might impact telling your story through different formats and mediums?
Absolutely. So I'm a big advocate for stories told live, in person, partly because it's a big part of our identity and also part of the tradition of the sacredness of what happens when we create those moments of coming together, like we did in Hamburg. When we come together, there's something really sacred about sitting on the front porch or on a stage, telling it live. But we live in the digital era, and we think about that there are audible formats and ways in which people experience the story. And I'll give you one example of that. If I ask an older person, I think there's some backfeed. Maybe people could unmute their phone if they're not speaking. That might help. Florence, I don't know if you're able to mute your phone. Okay. So I think so. If I ask an elder person, a baby boomer, for example, and ask them about, what's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of, the most likely would talk about storytelling from the sort of tradition of the oral tradition, my grandmother's stories, my parents' stories, they're growing up in that sort of space where people would get together and they would talk and they would share stories before the time of multimedia. If you ask a young person, their entry might be through This American Life, podcasts, The Moth Radio Hour, StoryCorps, and I think there's been an explosion of stories being presented through the multimedia. Now, we know that when personal narrative was particularly introduced in the public radio, became popular. Radio shows became more popular when they were able to embed stories. We now know that in the international development sector, that when we use stories as a powerful medium, we can communicate messages more effectively. Everyone's doing it, or they're realizing its power. So there's multiple formats, but I think the danger in that, and there is danger in it, is that it can also be used for propaganda. It can be used it can help us push us into silos. So I think it's thinking about it in the various formats, whether it's done through documentary film, whether it's done through podcasts, whether it's done through YouTube, multimedia, and I think these are really powerful and important tools to think about. But the danger of what can happen when storytelling might be used as a force to move us in a direction that's about manipulation. And I give you examples of fracking companies or elected officials that are using it to create messages and to manipulate people. Going to examples of that. But I also think I put one example of, the stock exchange can be affected within 24 hours from stories told. That's not just live in person, but that is using multimedia, the news, social media, etc. A story can move faster than the speed of light using that digital era. But I also just think that what I advocate for, and I think what we should advocate for, is if we think about storytelling as the ethics of it, as something that's sacred, as something that's part of our traditions, it's a kind of a philosophy, really, then we see the sacredness in it, and hopefully empower the next generation to call out the BS when they see an elected official using it in the wrong way. But one of the powerful ways I could see it in using social media context is the students from Parkland that are advocating against gun violence and gun control and change in policy. You see Malala using it in a particular sense. Greta Thunberg advocating for a cause that's really important to her and for our planet. And I think when it's used in that way, and I think those such as Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and they were very aware of these mediums. So you can create that visual story, but I think it's all very much part of when it's used as a force to bring people together, then I'm all for it. When it's used as a way to divide us, then I'm not. I can't stop that from happening. I can only advocate for what I think is right. I hope that answers that question, Bill.
Looks like Frances has her hand up.
Frances, do you want to unmute?
Yes. How are you? Thank you for doing this.
No problem.
In my professional life, I find myself either a single speaker or a panelist, or sometimes a workshop leader. And each of those also usually includes a question and answer period where you can't necessarily predict the content. What are some storytelling techniques that we can employ to deliver our message better in those settings, given that they're not necessarily going to be our indigenous stories, but take it from there and we'll see what happens.
That part I'm not really sure how to answer, apart from how to keep a repertoire of stories at the forefront of your brain and think that, remember, it always takes about a process when you allow for space and silence and time. But I think if you were to the more you practice your stories and the stories that matter to you, then they're always going to stay at the forefront of your brain, if that makes sense. I think that I'm not really sure how to answer that specifically on how to predict a question, apart from knowing that if I'm advocating for a cause or an idea, then I want to make sure that I know why that idea matters to me, why I support that cause. And then the story that I tell come from the heart. I can talk about my real experiences. And when somebody asked me a question, I've maybe go to an example. When somebody asked me a question a couple of years ago, and it was in Washington, D.C. at the nation's capital, and it was about movement building, what it's like to live in it, why the importance of storytelling. So I referred to an actual example where I was, the year before that, I was down in Baton Rouge in Louisiana, United States, and I was there at the time when a young black man was killed by the police, Alton Sterling, and I was there at that moment. And I remember watching the news that morning in a cafe downtown, and the news had projected that there was a riot in downtown Baton Rouge. And we looked around, there was no riot at all. It was the way that it had been portrayed in the media. And I realized since then, as an outsider living in this country, I've seen a legitimate movement such as Black Lives Matter been demonized over that period of time. And that's really when I was advocating for why the importance of telling that example, the importance of when we come together and hear the stories from the source, from the person, is so much more important and so much more reliable, because there's always truth in that story if it comes from an individual. You don't have to agree, but there's no such thing as a fictive story when it holds truth for the teller, because it holds meaning. It's just how we listen to it. That's probably not really answering your question in the way that you might have expected or might be helpful, but it's my best attempt on that one, I'm afraid. Any other questions? Would anybody like to respond to that, what Francis just spoke about?
Hi, Kiran. This is Rukmini.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for doing this session for us. And I'm thinking of multiple ways to look at collaborations going forward. For now, the question that's alive for me is, have you had any experience in terms of combining storytelling in a dialogue-based kind of a process, and how does that work? And the context that I'm looking at here specifically is the political situation in India currently, and we've had fairly disturbing news today in terms of the legal status of Kashmir being changed, and that there has been well, I guess the way we've been experiencing this government has been in terms of a lot of voices that should be sharing their stories being really shut out. So I'm wondering if there's any way that one can incorporate storytelling as a part of a social or a community dialogue process, if you could shed some light on that.
I mean, it's a big subject. Of course, there's plenty of examples of storytelling using a sort of a conversational or to enhance dialogue. One methodology I would talk about, and I think we used that on conferences, is actually developed by Juanita Brown. Juanita Brown is the founder of the World Cafe. We used it at the conference, but we didn't really acknowledge that process. And I would suggest, first point, going to the World Cafe as a place, looking up the processes of how Juanita Brown has incorporated storytelling. She lives very near to here and embraced storytelling as a kind of a movement as part of the World Cafe. That's that suggestion, and I think every context is going to be those complexities. For me, the examples that I can probably perhaps talk more about is in the context of the work that I was working in using storytelling in Northern Ireland, and particularly working with people coming out of a 30-year war, emerging from a 30-year war. The tensions were still there, but it got to a point where we were able to use storytelling as part of that process to build empathy and understanding and dialogue. the way that we would do that would remember the place really matters. The place in which it has to be a number of different partners. And we would bring communities part of from the Northern Ireland government. There could be politicians, there could be faith leaders, community leaders. Some of them were ex-paramilitary and military personnel. But they would come to a museum in Glasgow, a cultural space, and they got funding, and we then would facilitate these questions. But some of the questions that I would ask was, I've been using that as a sort of technique ever since, is not what's your story. Never start with that. Start with what are the moments that made you want to work for peace in the world? What was your moment that made you think differently about this process? And when we start with these kind of particular moments, then we start removing this front identity of Republican, Democrat, Tory, Labour, political party, religion, and we go to the real essence of where our stories lie, in our joy and in our suffering, in our healing, in our family, our belief. These is the blood, our soul. And when we can unpack those stories and bring that to the surface in a safe space, then that builds the empathy and promotes the dialogue, the discourse. The dialogue can happen in many different ways. The discourse can happen, again, in multiple formats. It requires strategic partners. One context of which we're doing it, and I'd say, speak openly, in the context of the United States right now, which is an interesting place to be as a brown immigrant. And I'd say that, and particularly what's happening with this administration, which I'm not a fan of. And recently the way I used it was a couple of weeks ago in a vigil, a national vigil called Lights for Liberty, that was bringing awareness to what's happening on the US-Mexican border with the detention of young kids in children detention camps. Now, I was asked to be a speaker, but I live in a very conservative part of the country. So the way I did that was I told my own story. And immediately people realize that when you tell your own story, no one can argue with that, because that's your story. People inherently, they know that's your story, so it can't be argued with. It's not coming from the media. I'm not tweeting it. I'm telling it live in the moment, and it's my story. And I told a story about my family coming to Britain as immigrants and the kindness of people that ensured that I could survive and I could be here with you today. And really sort of drawing on values and kindness as a superpower. But I told my own story. Now, I think to promote a dialogue process in any context, in any spaces, is creating those spaces for that occur, for people to have an opportunity to hear one another's stories, to have face-to-face contact, real contact with one another, so they can be the last person to interpret the story is always going to be the listener. You can't interpret that story for them. You can only tell it. But that person has to make up their own mind, create their own meaning from it in their own pace, in their own time. If we can create those spaces, then I think that's an important place. But being part of a movement, collectively doing it together to create those spaces is part of the strategy, I think. Rukmina, is that helpful? Do you want to elaborate or respond to that?
That is insightful, in fact, Kiran. I think I have some more thoughts on that, but I guess I'll probably write to you separately on it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's 11 o'clock.
Yeah, we've got maybe a couple of minutes, so maybe we just have a couple of more, or one more question perhaps, if anybody has one.
Actually, there were some really good ones in the comments, and I'm getting some feedback, so I'll be fast. Someone who works in impact evaluation, stories of impact tend to resonate with donors the most. So what's the best way to incorporate data and information into a story?
Okay, that is moving into an area that's not my expertise. But I would try to imagine that story is data. That's the only thing I would suggest in that one. is consider, imagine, and consider and encourage the idea that stories is your data, is part of your data of equal value to the other types of data that you might be using. And I think, again, I'm going back, let me give a quick example that comes to mind is Brian Stevenson. I referenced him in the talk. Brian Stevenson gives an incredible TED talk. We need to talk about injustice. And I listened to that talk over and I encourage you to do that as well. Because what he does, he talks about data, but he doesn't start off with that. He talks about growing up as a young kid and his experience with his grandmother when he was 9 years old. And his grandmother takes him by the hand, takes him outside, says, and promise him 3 things: that he will be good to his mother, that he would never drink alcohol, and he'll always do the right thing. And he talks about that and how it shaped him into the person he is today. And then he ends with some of the data. He uses it very, he talks about the incarceration rates. If we were to, if 1 in 9 planes has a potential to be faulty, why would we execute people? Why do we still execute people? Sorry, 1 in 9 people on death row has there's been a case that it wasn't 100% sure that they were wrong. Would we still do the same thing if we were to get on a plane? So I'm not giving that example very well, but using data to back up the story. And I think people understand the story, they engage with the story, they bring you in, and they can create the visual space. But then the data is used to kind of like, maybe the other statistics can be used to back it up as evidence in some way. But I would begin always with a story. And I would think of your story as your data too, of equal value.
Thanks. Just one more. Natalie asks, what's the most ethical manner to tell stories? Are there guidelines they can follow to ensure stakeholders are represented ethically?
Okay. I'm really glad you asked, because ethics is incredibly important. I mean, there are guidelines. There's a website called Ethics of Storytelling. It might be called Ethics Storytelling, but Ethics of Storytelling or Storytelling Ethics. If you Google that, you'll come up to that resource. The storytelling toolkit that I wrote, Telling Stories That Matter, is available. It doesn't go into depth on the ethics, but the whole toolkit is designed to encourage ethical collection of stories. And I do that in a way because it was specifically designed for peace builders, community builders, so they can apply it in their work. I think you always remember that the story doesn't belong to you, okay, if you're collecting a story from someone. So and I think a lot of it comes down to remembering you to do the right thing, that if you're going to use this story in some way, have you got permission? Have you sought permission? Are you doing it collaboratively? Who are you actually serving? And maybe as a folklorist, we think about it, the person that you always serve is the person you're collecting the story from. How is it going to help to support them and empower them? And can you gift that story to that individual in a way that you're just a kind of a facilitator of that story collection, as opposed to bringing it to your own space? I think a lot of it, there are these other guidelines, and I think I would look up, storytelling itself does not have a formal international guideline as a genre of ethics, because it hasn't been created into a field, but anthropology and folklore have, and I would align ourselves more to those fields. And in the 60s and 70s, I think it was, that was important because anthropologists had to come together as a community when they realized that we're being asked by the government to be able to go and do certain types of work, and then they had to kind of really create these stronger guidelines about how you, so maybe sort of look up the AAA, the American Anthropology Association, the American Folklore Society. You could use my toolkit as just a kind of a simple kind of guide. It's not a whole outline, or Ethics of Storytelling, but really sort of use also your gut instinct. Does it feel wrong? Is it my story? Does it belong to me? Think about it as an object. When British Museum people went out and collected objects in Africa and South Pacific, in India, across the world, they may have at the time thought this is the right thing to do. But you go to the British Museum today in London, Africa is displayed in the basement, still to this day, which is a message about how they see the hierarchy of race. European art is at the top, Asian is at the middle, and African art is in the basement. And that presents a message. So we might be thinking at the time we're collecting this story because we want to do good, but how is that story and the work that we're doing now going to be used when we're no longer here? And that's the thing that we're always doing, preserving it in a way, but doing it in a way that's serves that community and empowers that community. And again, they're just guidelines, guideline ideas. Okay, I think I am going to have to end. It's 5 past. So thank you all very much for tuning into this first pilot. And again, this is our first time doing this session. So I'd love to have your feedback. My email is kiran@storytellingcenter.net. Center is spelled with a US spelling. So it's a ER at the end. Storytellingcenter.net, KIRAN. Love to have your feedback, any feedback about improving it, making it better, or maybe doing it again in some format. And keep in touch, and wonderful to connect with you all this morning. See you.